what emerged with Ghost Story ultimately was that it works best as a standalone piece. That I think if you love the book and are waiting for the moments that were in the book that are some of your favorite moments that aren't there, you're going to be ticked off. And if you can separate or just enjoy the experience for what it is, it's the most egregious example of anything I've ever worked on, where a lot just got left out that pained me as much as it pained some of the fans.
A lot of the pleasures of a novel are this interior life that you're able to spend time with. And you can spend pages and pages inside somebody's head in a way you just can't do in a movie. You just struggle to respect what you think is the sort of essence of the novel in terms of the characters, in terms of the emotional progression and what it is that the reader is experiencing, and you see if you can capture that with the grammar and limitations of film, which are quite different. Well, before I even went to Hollywood, I made educational films. So, I did everything. You would write the screenplay and you'd shoot them and edit them. So that's how I really learned and became interested in feature filmmaking. And I didn't know anybody. And I went on to business school and figured out that in those days, for $9,600, you could finance a high-budget screenplay. And I thought that was the sort of easiest way in for a newcomer. And I raised a little money, including from a finance professor in business school, and went out and approached these writers that I loved, like Andy Lewis, who'd written Clute, and Ross MacDonald, who wrote his first screenplay for me. And, those days, first of all, it was an exciting time in Hollywood, but in those days, writers were sort of at the bottom of the food chain, and they were really happy to be in a relationship where the producer was going to back them, and I would make deals where I would guarantee that they could do the first rewrite, and where I would make them co-producers, and those were wonderful times. And I worked with great writers on great screenplays, and that's how I ended up at Universal with a sort of overall deal, and that's how I got to Ghost Story.
As circumstances, being in the right place in the right time, luck, obstinance, persistence, and every other thing I had at that point in time, I got a manuscript of a first novel that was by, again, a school teacher living in Maine, thought to be his first novel, and it was this little unprepossessing, slim 200-page volume called Carrie. The opportunity presented itself for me to do the screenplay.
I really hit it off with Larry, and he's a wonderful writer, and I was a big fan of Carrie.
So in a weird way, I'd say it was Stephen King inadvertently, and maybe not so inadvertently, that brought me to Peter Straub in Ghost Story, even though at the time I had no recognition that that was the case. But that was the beginning and the origin, which was I became sort of the go-to screenwriter for the horror genre in particular, although there were other movies. I sat and met with Streisand to discuss writing Yentl. I met with Burt Reynolds to do The Bourne Identity. I met with Neil Diamond's producers to do The Jazz Singer. I didn't do any of those, but along the way in all of these submissions, I had met a woman named Marianne Maloney, who was the executive, first at the agency where I worked. She was an agent. She got a job as a production executive at Universal.
There were 7 projects at Universal in those days, including Raggedy Man and Time and Again, which Robert Redford was involved in. There was a whole series of projects that I had developed and had come together at Universal.
They gave her on arrival about 4 projects to produce with Burt, and they gave the project of Ghost Story. They had paid an ungodly sum of money even then, which was $1 million, I believe, was the fact. And the book arrived and was in 2 gigantic boxes, in stark contrast to Carrie. It was 500 pages of densely plotted, intricate, amazing prose. And it wasn't something like Carrie that I could sit down and zip my way through in one reading, even being the speed reader that I am. It took a while. I was wowed by Peter's capabilities. I mean, he had written 2 other little novels that I'd known of, but this was the game changer in every respect. It was one of those pieces of material, I think, that come along every year or two. It got a lot of stunning reviews. It got advertising dollars from Universal. So it was very prominent as a property, and the expectations that came with it were very prominent as well. But I think there were a lot of critics who would not even bother reviewing a normal piece of horror that was a straightforward piece. Most of them were in the realm of, let's say, successes like Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist, and they were very, however well done, they were very straight ahead, one line through setups to deliver. So they weren't complicated. You could describe them in a tagline, 1, 2, 3, and you got it, and it was a situation. Ghost Story, I think, appealed to the more literary critics who appreciated that A, he was trying to elevate the genre, B, he was trying to eat the genre in one book, and consciously cast back to Henry James, to Edgar Allan Poe, to Nathaniel Hawthorne, to a tradition, some of whom he named the principal older men in the book. That was a really high-toned, elevated version of horror that got its thrills from a level of dread and a submersion in a psychological way, as opposed to boo, boo, boo every 3 seconds.
But they loved the book, and they, it was Tom Mount then, and Ned Tannen, and Marianne Maloney was the executive in charge, and she worked with me on all of the projects I worked on. And we sort of had a little setup where we were developing screenplays, and I had really good relationships with lots of first-rate writers, including Larry.
I met with Bert Weisbord, the producer. I spent some time with Marianne and with Ned Tannen, who was the main executive who ran Universal Pictures at the time, who was an amazing guy. And I focused at that point on how to adapt this piece into the confines of a 2-hour movie. When I read it, I knew there was a surfeit of stuff that would never make it into the film.
I mean, the book was really, I thought, extraordinary, but there was more book than we could make in a movie. I mean, it was just so much stuff. So the first and one of the hardest things was sort of distilling what was it in the book that was going to be the essence of the screenplay.
The frustrations I had were clear right at the top when I started to work, because I saw we were edging toward a 3-hour movie, if not a 4-hour movie, if I were to retain many of the elements I was in love with.
We had a terrific time. What I did when I worked with writers is I would go over draft after draft of the screenplay, and Larry and I did that. And for many, many months, long before John was even involved.
And my process is very much sitting down with 3x5 cards at that point in time, pre-computers, on a corkboard wall, and laying out the bottom line story of what's the non-negotiable part of this piece that wants to be told and that I'd like to go see. And that piece was very clear and very easy, relatively speaking, and remains the spine of the piece today, which is 4 as opposed to 5 old men. I jettisoned one of them instantly, feeling we didn't need him, and he was already dead when the novel story began in the present. A combination of 4 old men who did something awful in their youth and are haunted by it in increasing respect today, plus a young protagonist who is, in my version, the son rather than the nephew of one of these 4 men, who returns to town for a very major reason, as opposed to being invited back to help the men, but because his brother has died at the hands, he believes, of this creature that is giving them all nightmares. So that was the beginning, and we never lost that part of it. However, unlike all the other books that we've chatted about, Peter had a dozen other big and small novels in the story. What made me want to do it, on reading it, to go back to just the initial impulse, was I learned later from Peter, who confirmed this as a fact to me, that he'd been very influenced and liberated by the existence of Salem's Lot and Stephen King. He felt it gave him the courage to do this kind of canvas and attempt this kind of encapsulation of the horror genre. He too was interested in a Peyton Place-like town in which there were dozens of Thornton Wilder stories, and in addition to a handful of big little stories that could easily have been standalone novels by themselves. So the task in looking at this was, is there a way to do all of that? I quickly concluded no. And began, as I tend to prioritize. And the two pieces that stood out that I thought were the non-negotiable parts that made Ghost Story were the Don Wanderley young protagonist story about being an instructor at a college, falling in love with a beautiful, very strange girl who messes with his mind. And at a given point in time, he breaks off the relationship because she's almost made him insane. And he's relieved to have her out of his life. Spoiler alert, he gets a phone call from his brother in New York who's telling him he's going to be married. Who's the girl? Her. Only for the brother to shortly commit suicide and or die. Secondly, there's the story that's the final reveal of the men, of what they actually did 50 years ago. And that story, to me, again, was the primal piece of this material that explains why they're haunted, why they're so screwed up, and how their guilt is manifesting something today. Those two pieces and the linkage between them became the backbone of what I could hold on to in the story. When I began writing, there were lots and lots and lots of other pieces, and the first script was hugely long because he tried to hold on to the two old maid sisters whose horses are exsanguinated, and that was one story. There was a farmer whose sheep have their throats slit and they're exsanguinated, and gradually the figure that he saw in the middle of a snowy night comes to him and whispers to him, and half mad persuades him to kill his family. There was the story of one of the old men that was pivotal as a story for my tastes, that there's just a glimpse of in the movie. That was the Sears James, the John Houseman's character's early days as a teacher, when he tries to save a young boy whose older brother he thinks is dangerous, only to learn that the older brother is long dead and has come to claim this boy. And that's another story that doesn't end well. So in short, I could go on for 5 more minutes listing them. There wasn't a way, in short, to hold on to a great deal of that. I think in retrospect, we were ahead of our time, just that little crucial bit, meaning the entire wave of miniseries for television and novels for television was just beginning in 1978 and 9 with Roots and with Salem's Lot. And the expanse of having 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours was something that Ghost Story certainly could have used and benefited from, because it would have been a true novel for television. As it was, Universal had paid $1 million for the rights. They wanted the movie as their next big, huge Christmas release, and the task was, how do you get it into 2 hours and make it work?
I think that the screenplay is very clear. It does capture the essence of the book. It captures those wonderful characters.
I also got in touch and got to know Peter a bit. And I think Peter, at the outset, certainly looked at the first drafts of it and both had some hope that it was going to be faithful in spirit, if not in letter, to what he had written.
Generally, when I was working with writers in those days, and this was certainly true with Larry, there was mutual respect so that we both had to be happy. You know, it's like if there was something that was bothering him, we'd look at it together until he was satisfied. If there was something that didn't feel right from my point of view, Larry was always willing to take a look at it. And that, of course, continued with John Irvin, because once John got involved, there was an ongoing dialogue between John and Larry about the screenplay. And so there were further drafts after that.
When Universal received the first draft, they were very gung-ho about it, long that it was, and immediately sent it out to the A-list directors, which was a major project for them, without any question.
The first thing that you do as a producer is, in this case, was to work with the writer. The next thing was to get a director. And of course, I want to give a lot of credit to Marianne Maloney, who was she comes from publishing, who did a very good job of helping with the screenplay, and she was part of those conversations.
One day, Marianne called to say that she'd heard of a young English director named John Irvin, who had just directed a 7-episode multi-parter of John le Carré's huge novel, Tinker Tailor. Universal said yes to him instantly. 5 minutes of watching Tinker Tailor, they thought he was great at mood and would be a terrific choice for us. I met with John, who is a fantastic person. He has got enormous energy and vitality, a wicked sense of humor, a great, huge, infectious laugh, and is smart. And we got on enormously well. I went over to London, spent lots of time going to galleries to look at Andrew Wyeth paintings. Francis Bacon was a major idea of John's for the vision of the ghost in the piece. And what I came to realize was that John, having a background as a documentarian and being a realist in his movies, had a particular vision of the movie that he wanted to carve out and wanted me to write.
I think the development period is when you get the screenplay to a point where the studio wants to make it and you're presenting it to directors and to actors. And after that, once you've cast the picture and once you've we did rehearsals, once you get a feel of how things are working, you can improve it further still. I wouldn't call that development, maybe improvement.
I will take you places where you have never been. I will show you things that you have never seen. And I will see the life run out of you.
I think the mood of the picture remains incredible, and the kind of people, the cinematographer Jack Cardiff, who he'd worked with, who was one of the legendary cinematographers of all time, Albert Whitlock, who had done the matte paintings for all of Hitchcock's movies, Philippe Sard, who did the unbelievably emotive, haunting score for the movie that was a musical narrative of its own, Dick Smith, who did the amazing makeup of the ghost, along with Rick Baker. The A-list level of talent for the movie could not have possibly been better.
Well, and don't forget Tom Rolfe, our editor. I mean, extraordinary editor. I think John really had a vision of the cast, and I think John took the lead.
The ability to have Astaire, Houseman, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., Melvin Douglas, Patricia Neal, all in one movie and united in a film was just a world-shattering great experience. The real success, and one of the reasons I'd say one should see Ghost Story all by itself and is worth it, is Alice Krige, who plays the double roles in the movie. And she had just done Chariots of Fire. Happily, Miss Krige, who had some astonishingly ghostly, ethereal quality at 26, was the perfect match for the film. And I look back on, among other things, her in this movie as just one of the great, where I think she, Peter Straub, and I are all on the same page together, which is just a success.
We filmed in two places, Woodstock, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs. And Saratoga Springs had all the old houses where the interiors were. The exteriors were mostly in Woodstock, Vermont. On the first day of shooting, what I was struck by was that there had been all this prep. We had hundreds of trucks that were around the green in Woodstock, Vermont, and everybody ready, and you end up sitting around waiting for a lot of the time. And it was not, I don't remember what the shot was, and of course all the shots were important, but it was a little bit anticlimactic. But, John just took charge and it happened, and, first day in, still on schedule, so we were okay. I spent a lot of time buying snow. I actually spent time with the Olympic Committee with trying to get snow machines because, we'd pick this area and there's snow throughout the movie. But the snow didn't cooperate. And we worked it out. But that's kind of a glib answer because the producer does many more things. There's all sorts of budget review and making sure that we have what we need for what's coming up and altering schedules when weather doesn't permit. But it's a lot of crisis management.
Marianne Maloney, the exec at the studio, is a real old friend, and we just chatted over the weekend and tripped down memory lane together on a few of these incredible dinners that we would have with the four legendary actors, and I wish they'd filmed those dinners because they were something to behold.
We did have a test screening. I thought it went pretty well. We had some concerns about the length and the timing, the pacing within scenes, and there's always a little anxiety.
What Peter wrote was not a ghost story at all. It was a story about a supernatural creature that has existed from the dawn of man, or certainly Jamestown, Virginia, and Roanoke, that's a shapeshifter, that takes on the appearance of people, that can change its shape from a woman to a man to a little girl to an animal to a lynx to the ultimate last piece of the novel and the cover of the book, a wasp. I think when John and I sat down together, John just didn't believe in any of those things, and he didn't believe in evil in the world that way. And when we sat down and started looking at the classic ghost stories of that time that had been on film, The Innocents, that had been Turn of the Screw as an example, they were very tame. They dealt and traded in mood and atmosphere, and they creeped you out under your skin and the hair went up on your back, but nothing ever scared you where the entire audience screamed at one point. And I think finally, an audience was looking for that. I remember reading sections of the book where I was happy to have the lights on.
There were some changes made, and Verna Fields, who was an editor at Universal who had edited Jaws, actually, was consulted, and there was some series of meetings about, how we could tighten certain things, but these seemed to me to be sort of normal adjustments. These were not radical changes.
There were a number, and I mean a number of pieces that were shot for this movie, scenes, images, sequences, that just got cut out of the movie, or little remnants of them remain. When the audience, let us say in Boston, first got a glimpse of this movie, they, I think in the long run, weren't scared by it in the conventional expectation way that Psycho scares one as a movie and you hear people jump, or at the very end of Carrie when the hand comes out of the ground. I think there was a sense that we still needed more of that. And Dick Smith went back and created more images. I can't remember whether the image of this girl with no face with a naked figure was a sort of shock nightmare image for one of the men. And I think we finally had too many of them. So that one went the way. I missed the scene in which everything went crazy in the farmhouse. It was an indelible idea, I think a really good one. And again, I don't think it fit the tenor of the movie that John was after as a director. The nature of this ghost in the movie, or this creature in the movie, was that it could make people see things and make things happen, and to scare the living hell out of anyone it came to, because the intent of the ghost creature in Peter's book was to destroy the town. It had been injured in the accident with the old men, but it hadn't been killed. The genius idea, and it's one of the great images that I adore from the movie today, is they decide to cover up their secret, the men. They put her body in the back seat of a car and they shove it into the pond. And as it's going down, up she comes in the rear window. Or does she? I loved that idea, and it remained emblematic of the movie in my mind. I look at it and I go, that's exactly the film I hoped we would be.
In the end of the day, feature films, at least at that time, were a director's medium. I mean, if you really wanted to put your imprint on a film, I mean, the director's the one that is making the decisions about which takes are working, and that's as it should be. And I sort of had to decide whether I wanted to be a director or not. That was really what was going through my head. And I had young children. I had 3 young children at the time, and I'd watched, John was like, it was like being on a cattle drive. He was, gone for 6 months, and I mean, he was great at it, but I didn't want that life with young children. So I decided to write. That's really when I decided to start writing. And since then, I've become a novelist. I mean, this is a contrast to producing. And producing, you're doing a lot of managing other people's problems. When you write a novel, you're managing your own problems. I mean, you're thinking about what you want to think about. And that was a great, that's always, I'm one of these people that was, from the first time I started writing, I've always enjoyed the writing process. So I feel very lucky with that. So it was a very good evolution. And it really harkens back to the working on the screenplays, which is where it started.
I look back at it being my father's son, that the glass is half full. I look at the parts of Ghost Story that are very much the movie that was in my head, or like Alice Krige, the performance that was in my head. And I listen to the music without the movie, and I'm in heaven. So I look at the good of it, and the less good parts for me have receded in terms of having import, or striking blood or fear in my heart. The ultimate thing is it's only a movie. The dream is that you want the dream of the picture that was in your head that sparked you to begin with as an adapter to be what's on screen. And it has nothing to do with the experience, has been my experience, meaning De Palma was not, it was a fine collaboration. Intellectually, we weren't particularly friendly. He wasn't especially warm or cordial, and we didn't have the best time with each other. The result was fucking thrilling. It was beyond my expectations. He beat the page almost in every instance, which is a rare thing for a writer to say. The experience with John, I adored him. I was crazy for him. And there were moments where I just looked at him and I couldn't figure out what he was seeing versus what I was seeing. And so that's just a stand back position. I've learned more over the years, having written a lot more and having a lot more experiences with directors. I think it's a really critical decision, and they get made for so many reasons about why certain people end up working on certain projects. Sometimes it's to the great betterment of everybody, and sometimes it's not.